Hello, thank you for tuning in. So this is going to be a session by Cerys Knighton and myself, Rhys Bevan-Jones, about representations of the mind, and aspects of mental states and mental illness. So Cerys is a PhD student at Cardiff University, interested in representations of manic depressive illness in the 19th century. She also creates artwork based on both research and her own experiences of bipolar disorder. And we were both asked to do this together because of our shared interest in representations of the mind. After Cerys presents her talk, I'll go on to talk about my projects in the realm of clinical work and public engagement and medical education. So diolch, thank you, and over to Cerys.
Thank you, Rhys, for the introduction. I'll just start sharing my screen. So as mentioned, I'm coming to this talk from two perspectives, the one being my own lived experience of bipolar disorder and the other my research into diagnostic classifications associated with manic depressive illness and representations of manic depressive illness in the 19th century. Today I'm going to talk a bit about this research into medical, literary and visual representations in the 19th century, and I'm going to talk a bit about creating artwork based on both this research and my own experiences of bipolar disorder. So I create artwork using ink pointillism, pencil and clay. Pointillism is a drawing technique which involves layering thousands of individual ink dots, and you can see that in this example here in the swan made entirely of dots in contrast to the swan with layers of pencil. Clay is something that I've started to work with more recently. I started to experiment with working with clay during the first lockdown period, which is something that I'll talk a bit more about later on. So my research uses archival materials from the 19th century. I look at annual reports and patient case notes from hospitals, including the North Wales Asylum in Denbigh, the Gartnavel Royal Hospital in Glasgow, Inverness District Asylum and the Royal Edinburgh Asylum, and also articles in medical journals, so the Journal of Psychological Medicine and Mental Pathology, British Medical Journal, the Lancet, the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal, and so on. And then also literary and visual representations. So the 19th century didn't tend to separate the arts and sciences in the way that we often do now, but rather literary and medical writing could exist in the same spaces, sitting alongside each other in periodicals and drawing from each other. Medical writers would often illustrate ideas through literary examples, and literary writers might write in the form of medical cases. For example, two of the pieces of literature I look at are presented in the form of patient case notes. This relationship or even dialogue between medical and literary writing makes it possible to trace whether representations outside of the medical space either challenge or normalize medical ideas, and is therefore valuable to studying how social perceptions are shaped alongside medical developments in diagnostic classifications and forms of treatment. So my work isn't trying to say, this is bipolar disorder in the 19th century, but rather to think about the relationship between these changes. So combining artwork drawn from both my lived experience and my research, I hope to create a space for reflection, looking at how diagnostic classifications and social perceptions have developed to reflect on modern stigma. So here I have just a few examples of 19th century visual representation to give a very brief overview of how these representations are working within their 19th century context, and also how they've informed the artwork that I've created based on both my experiences and the research. So again, there was a close relationship between art and medicine through anatomical illustration. Charles Bell's Anatomy of Expression is a great example of this in its function of not just expanding medical knowledge, but also working as a handbook for artists concerned with accuracy. Part of the purpose of Bell's Anatomy of Expression was to talk about the foundation of expression in the bodily functions beneath the skin. And to do this, Bell talks about the capabilities of both human and animal expression, arguing that in contrast to animals, in humans, quote, there seems to be a systematic provision for that mode of communication and that natural language of expression, unquote. And for that reason, human expression, quote, is an index of the mind, having expression corresponding to each emotion, unquote. However, when talking about mania specifically, Bell describes the emotional expression as closer to that of animals and stating that it is associated instead with a form of restraint of expression, a quote, vacancy of mind and mere animal passion, unquote. Bell represents the expression of madness as animalistic because of this different sort of communication of expression, which is not an uncommon feature in representations of manic depressive illness at this time. representations often illustrated an idea of being somewhere between human and animal, and these ideas were often discussed in terms of both a want of expression and communication. For example, two of the literary texts I analyse are Samuel Warren's Passages of the Diary of a Late Physician from 1837, a literary text written in the style of patient case notes, and Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue from 1840. A chapter from the Warren text illustrates a fictional patient suffering with symptoms of manic depressive illness and does so by drawing on medical writing. The Poe text also illustrates symptoms of manic depressive illness, exploring them through communication and expression in the figure of an orangutan, and does this, I argue, by drawing specifically from the Warren text. It might be worth noting that in terms of critical discussions, this is a connection that hasn't been previously drawn between these two texts, which I think shows the benefits of concurrently reading medical and literary writing. Interestingly, there is also a earlier Welsh language short story written by Cymro Bach and published in 1830 in Saren Gomer, with no relation to the other two texts, but which also combines the figures of physician, patient, and orangutan to illustrate communication and expression in the context of manic depressive illness, which highlights the prominence of such animalistic representations. However, to turn back to visual representations, these animalistic depictions appear to change alongside significant changes in treatment. I will talk more in a minute about these specific changes in treatment as I will show some of the work I've created based on this, but first to think more about expression. In the asylum context, there was an idea that expression could help physicians diagnose patients because emotional experiences became ingrained in patients' features. This quote here from Alexander Morrison, a medical superintendent of the Surrey County Asylum, states, "The appearance of the face is intimately connected with and dependent upon the state of the mind. The repetition of the same ideas and emotions, and the consequent repetition of the same movements of the muscles of the eyes and of the face gives a peculiar expression." These ongoing emotional states were thought to stain patient expression, and in this way, there was an idea that expression could be analysed at different stages, a warning of developing symptoms, that it could confirm diagnosis, and that it could also show signs of recovery. Moving on to this other image on the slide here, this is a photograph from a patient at the Surrey Asylum. Hugh Welsh Diamond was Alexander Morrison's successor, and he took a series of photographs of his patients. Notably, Diamond's use of photography moved away from using expression as a map for a physician and a means of a physician perceiving mental illness to a means of self-reflection for patients. He writes about taking photographs at different stages of patients' ill health and how showing these images to patients has a positive impact on their chances for recovery. Ideas about recovery were tied to a patient recognizing their illness, and this became a means of doing so through images of patients analyzing their own expressions. So in these examples, we have, to summarize, ideas of animalism and vacancy of expression with Bell, ideas about repetitions of symptoms taking root in patient expression with Morrison, and patient self-reflection with Diamond. Here are a couple of examples of my own artwork. I think a lot about this idea of taking root, both in terms of the implication of emotional states and periods where difficult beliefs have taken hold. For me, things started to get really quite difficult by the time I was around 11 years old, and because I was so young, I didn't really have much knowledge about mental illness, and so drawing became a way of sort of trying to figure out what was happening and kind of just trying to express what I was going through and feeling. But now I do this more purposefully and use art as that kind of self-reflection, self-communication tool. It's a way of coming to terms with things, getting some separation from things, and ultimately recognizing things about my condition and how I'm managing. To give a couple of examples of artworks depicting the research, these pieces think about changes in perceptions of patients alongside changes in treatment. Treatment of manic depressive illness in the early 19th century was focused on bodily restraint and limiting nutrition, and as I briefly mentioned, representations are animalistic, illustrating patients with a want of expression and communication. However, this quote from F.D. Walsh, medical superintendent at the Lincoln County Asylum, demonstrates that treatment starts to change significantly towards the mid-19th century. Although a smaller institution, Lincoln Asylum was instrumental in this change. Walsh's predecessors, Edward Parker Charlesworth and Robert Gardner Hill, had sparked the debate about abolishing the use of mechanical restraint in a lecture given in 1838. In this quote, Walsh is describing one of his own experimental treatments which avoided the use of restraint or seclusion in the context of manic depressive illness specifically. Walsh states, "The treatment of mania is with us the very reverse of what it formerly was. Formerly, when patients were maniacal, an attempt was made to get them into a room, but now an attempt is made to get them into the open air. I ordered a man to play the violin to him and let him dance. He slept through the night, the first sleep he'd had since his admission. He gradually got well and made a perfect recovery. I think this case is remarkable as showing the evils of seclusion in cases of mania. In these pieces then, I wanted to give a sense of at first tying with ink to remove expression, but then unwinding to show this changing nature in treatment and change in the perception of patients. Combining then depictions of my own experiences and findings from the research hopes to create a broader space of reflection on how social perceptions towards manic depressive illness are shaped. As I said, illustrating my own experiences is a helpful self-communication tool, but exhibiting artwork has also meant that it becomes a bigger conversation and a space to reflect on modern perceptions of bipolar disorder. So I've tried to find out whether this is effective by asking for feedback alongside exhibitions. As the results show, many of the people who visited the exhibitions live with bipolar disorder themselves or have a loved one who does, and therefore are very familiar with it. However, out of the three groups, not very aware, somewhat aware, and very aware, 93% still said that they felt the exhibition had either changed or increased their knowledge about the condition. Specific statements in response to this pointed to things like the connection between the historical and modern, the challenging of misconceptions around the condition, and quite simply that shared conversation. The feedback would suggest that this combination of modern and that historical precedent is helpful for others living with this condition in terms of challenging social stigma and the feelings of loneliness and shame that stigma can cause. Statements also pointed to the depiction of specific symptoms, breaking the condition down and representing symptoms that maybe aren't talked about so often, and how recognised shared experiences was comforting and helpful for awareness. So this leads me to my final example of work, which is my current project with the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Wales. Much of the feedback I received referred to illustrations I'd created about sensory hypersensitivity, so I decided to focus on this for this project. I think misconceptions of bipolar disorder often involve simplifying the condition to just this kind of jump between happy and sad. So I think it's useful to create work that brings like the complexities and severities of the emotional states and what the feedback suggests are generally the lesser talked about aspects of the condition, but ones that can cause real day-to-day difficulties. The other artist on this project, Dodd, has been creating these amazing flags, drawing on the language of heraldry and depicting the broader states of bipolar disorder. So for my part in this project, I wanted to zoom in on an individual feature and to focus in detail on sensory hypersensitivity. Auditory hypersensitivity in particular is something I've had my challenges with, and observations about sensory hypersensitivity are also very much present in the 19th century case notes that I analyse. I wanted to depict this experience and that physical feeling of sensory overload. So for example, this heartbeat kind of toys on the idea of fight or flight, and this piece with the head with the skin kind of peeling away from itself thinks about that deterioration in understanding and inability to concentrate, the way you can see and hear things, but that connection is broken, and so it all just kind of gets lost in the fog. To create this piece, I used a combination of clay, driftwood, feathers, and flowers that I tried to dry into specific expressions and shapes to correspond with sensory function. And then this fourth piece is a large pointillism drawing to have that further contrast in texture and to tie the pieces together with that ongoing feeling. It is perhaps also worth noting that while these pieces are centered on the difficulties of sensory hypersensitivity, my move to working with clay was in itself out of a desire to work in a way that was more hands-on and had that kind of tactile experience. So in that way, the process of creating these pieces in themselves became helpful during the first lockdown period as a sort of sensory grounding that made use of the driftwood that I found on walks and feathers and flowers in the back garden. So by analysing medical, literary and visual representations, my research aims to examine the development of both diagnostic classifications and social perceptions. Creating artwork based on both this work and my own experiences, I hope to form a dialogue between past and present that creates a space to reflect on modern perceptions of bipolar illness and to challenge misconceptions. Thank you very much for listening, and I will now pass over to Dr. Jones. Diolch o galon.
Thanks, Gareth. So I'll share my screen now. So as I said, we both have a shared interest in visual representations or illustrations of the mind and aspects of mental health. And I'm going to describe my projects in terms of clinical work, public engagement, and medical education, where we've explored visual and other representations of the mind. And this has been part of my work as a psychiatrist and also research fellow at Cardiff University. And just to give a bit of context, so I'm dual trained in both child and adolescent and adult psychiatry with a special interest in youth mental health. Have been interested in teaching, research now for many years, but also have a background in visual communication, having trained in illustration, animation, and graphic design. And brought these interests together and the skills together, especially for my current fellowship, which is funded by a National Institute for Health Research and Health and Care Research Wales programme. And the main aim is to develop and trial a digital programme for mood and well-being in young people. So I've been fascinated for years now about different ways in which it's possible to represent the mind, the mental states and aspects of mental illness. Historically, psychiatry lacks the visual medical references of other medical specialties, although there are emerging findings, for example, in neuroimaging. And we rely more on symptoms and signs and possibly verbal means to communicate, assess, and manage. And it's a challenge really to represent subjective experiences and phenomena through visual means. I mean, this slide has an eclectic mix of images. From the top left there, there's the medieval cell doctrine, and then a phrenology bust. On the top right, illustration from a children's encyclopedia, and then on the bottom row, the numbskulls from the Beano comic, a painting by an individual who's experienced depression, and also a diagram from post-traumatic stress disorder therapy. And all of these images in different ways try to categorize, to compartmentalize different aspects of the mind through mind maps, models, metaphors, and so forth. There's also an issue in the media when, for example, there's an article in a newspaper dealing with mental health issues. Sometimes you would see an outdated image, for example, related to phrenology, although that has changed a little over the last few years with guidance from charities and other groups. And whilst at Kingston University, when I was studying illustration and animation, I asked lots of friends, colleagues, family members, how they would represent the mind, and asked them to draw or describe these ideas. And I developed prints based on these. And as you can see there, a mixture on the left there of different metaphors, different representations, different models. And this print has been used in different contexts, for example, winter school poster, cover of the British Journal of Psychiatry, and also different exhibitions. And on the same theme on the top right there is an illustration of the memory palace, which is an ancient practice involving the creation of a space or a structure within the head. So it could be a palace. And in that structure, you can store different images, different memories, and then go back into that structure to retrieve them. Also explored different ways of visually representing different mental states. So for example, depression on this slide. This has been mainly with medical students through teaching workshops where I've asked them whether they could draw or represent different mental states, including depression, mania, psychosis, and then use that as a platform to discuss different signs, symptoms, presentations, and our understanding of different experiences as well. And I've used illustrations as well in handbooks, slides, and presentations, but also explored visual representations of the mind and different mental health issues through film as well throughout history, both the good and the bad, and used film clips as a platform to discuss with medical students different presentations, again, signs and symptoms, aspects of classification and management, but also the ways that different mental states have been represented and the associated understanding, awareness, stigma related to mental illness in different media. And also explored this interest in public engagement projects. So, for example, I've been involved in 2 different week-long exhibitions now, both held at the Bay Art Gallery in Cardiff. This was organised by Julia Thomas, Jamie Lewis, Ian Jones and others. And this was really to show our work, but also to hold workshops with school groups, with medical students, with arts, poetry groups, to discuss different aspects of psychiatry and psychiatry research. And the process and the findings were published in a report and also a paper in the Research for All journal. And through these projects as well, we started to explore other media. So I worked with Gareth Roberts, who is a musician, and also worked with his band to explore auditory and musical representations of the mind, as well as visual ones. And we worked together to develop this animation based on the images that I showed on depression. So this animation can be found on YouTube if you follow that link or search my name. So this has the images, but also musical interpretation by Gareth and his band based on depression. I'll just show the first section of that animation to give you an idea of the work. So yeah, the full animation can be found on YouTube, but a more recent public engagement project I've been involved in is Representing the Mind, or Cynrychioli'r Meddwl. This was funded by an Arts Council of Wales grant, and it was a collaboration with the National Centre for Mental Health and Arts Care Gofal Celf, which is an arts and health group in West Wales. And again, I worked with Gareth to explore visual and musical representations of the mind. So we sent out a survey through the different groups, asking people how they would represent the mind through different media. About 60 responded, and we developed work based on these responses, as well as explorations of representations in other contexts and throughout history. And there's a blog about the project as well on the NCMH website through that link. We developed a series of what's known as graphic scores. So these are images and icons not traditionally associated with musical notation. And it's possible for musicians to respond to these prints and scores to create works of music. And each of these scores were based on different themes or different metaphors. So for example, there was a journey metaphor and a mechanical metaphor. Gareth and his band responded musically to these scores on the launch night, and we recorded these pieces. And more recently, we've developed animations based on the images and the music. So this is the most developed one so far. So again, this can be found on YouTube. And this is based on the mechanical metaphor. And the idea is that you can travel through the graphic score, through different mental states, seeing the animations and also listening to the music. So you can, and the idea is that, sorry, I finished that a bit too soon, but the idea is that it travels through the score then in this case, does that. So it pulls back then, loops into aspect. See the full version then on YouTube. I've also worked and brought together these interests and skills in digital mental health, and especially for this program called Mood Hub or Hub Hwyliau. And this is a digital program to support young people, families, carers, practitioners, and others concerned about young people, especially for mood and well-being and depression. And this was developed with young people and others to engage, promote self-help, help seeking where appropriate, and social support, based on design, educational, and psychological theory, initially based primarily on psychoeducation, but also expanded to include aspects of cognitive behavior therapy, interpersonal theory, and other theories as well. And it's full of illustrations, animations, and interactive components. Now you can see the welcome screen of the first version on the left there, with an illustration and tagline and user pathways for the young person, and another one for the those concerned, for example, parents and carers, and all the sections within the program, including one for families, friends, carers, and professionals. And this is to show that how we developed this from scratch, from sketches and post-it notes through to wireframes and initial screens. This was done through several interviews and workshops and focus groups with young people, and also parents and carers and practitioners, but also with a digital media company. And this is captured as well, the process and the findings in the paper in the Journal of Medical Internet Research. And we wrote a broader review of co-design in the context of digital mental health technologies for children and young people in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. And this is to show the work that went into the character design, the overall look, and the storyboards as well for the animation. So on the left there are examples of some of my drawings of characters and metaphors, and then I'd go back and forth with the animator and the digital media designer. This was important because we wanted to create something that was engaging, but also universal and inclusive. We went back and forth as well with the young people to ensure that this was acceptable. And we developed a series of animations for the program. And this is the introductory animation for young people as they log in. I'll show just the first section to give you an idea of the tone and the characters and the design.
It's normal for young people to feel down and not enjoy things sometimes. But when these feelings are severe, long-lasting, or keep coming back and begin to affect day-to-day life, this may be a sign of depression. Depression can affect people of any age, and each year, as many as 1 in 20 young people experience it.
This package is for young people, and for their families, friends, and professionals who work with young people who would like to know more about mood, depression, and other health issues. It also has advice on self-help and ways of staying well, and on where to get help.
You might use it because you're having difficulties. For example, if you're feeling down or stressed, it's possible that you only have some difficulties, or that you have many, which are affecting your life a lot. You may even have already been given a diagnosis of depression. Or maybe you're worried you might have difficulties in the future. For example, if someone in the family has had problems with their mood, or if you're under a lot of stress. Or it might be used by a family member, carer, friend, or professional who is worried about a young person.
This package has been developed from talking to lots of young people.
But very welcome to get in touch with me to learn more about the programme. And we did an early evaluation with over 40 young people who used it over a couple of months and completed questionnaires before and after using it. And also we did a series of interviews. And overall, they found it was engaging, user-friendly, comprehensive and helpful. And you can see from the quotes there, we had a lot of favourable feedback, but also suggestions on how to change it. And this is captured as well in another article. And we're now planning a bigger trial across Wales and in Scotland as well, recruiting through schools, primary mental health teams, youth services and charities. And we'll do online adverts as well, asking young people who are experiencing low mood whether they'd like to try the programme, but also compare it with another digital information pack. And we hope to start this in the next few months. So if anyone's interested in learning more or helping with a study, then do get in touch. My email's at the end. And finally, this is another project I've been involved in, an animation to help children and their families and carers to learn more about ADHD. And we, again, developed this with children and also their parents and carers. You can find the link to the animation and more information on the National Centre for Mental Health website. And you can see from the screenshots as well about the work that went into the character design, the overall look, and also metaphors. And this was led by Sharifa Shamimaga at Cardiff University. So hopefully I've been able to give you a taste of the projects going on in Wales, and especially Cardiff University, and in terms of helping individuals, families, carers, practitioners in different contexts, both in terms of clinical work and public engagement and also education. Do get in touch if you'd like to learn more about any of these projects, and especially the upcoming trial. That's my email address there, and also my social media handle. So diolch o galon, thanks a lot to all the young people and other participants who have helped with the different studies. Thanks to Ceris and also the Welsh Psychiatric Society and Royal College of Psychiatrists for inviting us. Diolch yn fawr, and we'll finish there.